Welcome to an introduction to educational research. Today's video will deal with the concept of variables and the concept of validity. These are two very important concepts, and there are several vocabulary words you will want to become very familiar with when you're reading and analyzing research. So the objective of the video is to define and explain several important vocabulary terms that you'll use when you're reading and analyzing research. Okay, the first term is a variable, and a variable is something that varies. So it can take on a quality, and then it can vary and take on another quality. In mathematics, and especially if you've taken algebra, you'll know that X and Y and Z letters usually represent variables, which can be different numbers. Has a slightly different meaning in research. But let's take a look at, this is a title of a research article that you have already read, I believe, Prompting Bar Patrons with Signs to Take Free Condoms. Well, research like this, which was an actual scientific study, has variables in it. It has an independent variable, it has dependent variables, and it can have confounding or extraneous variables. So let's take a look at each of those. The independent variable is the intervention or the intervention strategy or the cause of the change in the observed behavior. So the independent variable is the cause in a cause and effect relationship. In the article Prompting Bar Patrons with Signs to Take Free Condoms, the prompting of the bar patrons with signs, that was the independent variable. That was the intervention. The researchers were trying to find out that if signs were present, would people take more condoms? So the independent variable, or the cause, in this case it would be the presence of signs, that is the independent variable. And a way of remembering that, or at least a trick that I'd used when I was trying to remember them a long time ago, is independent variable and intervention both begin with the letter I. So it's the intervention, whatever the researcher is using to try and change the behavior, the intervention or intervention strategy, that is the independent variable. Now, the dependent variable is the effect or the change in behavior as a result of the application of the intervention strategy or the independent variable. So the change in behavior is dependent on the application of the intervention or independent variable. In this case, the effect was the number of condoms taken. That was the change. So that was the dependent variable. It was dependent on the intervention or the independent variable. And a good way to remember that is you can almost always determine the dependent variable in a research study by asking, what are the researchers collecting data on? Well, in this case, they were collecting data on the number of condoms taken. So that is the dependent variable. And what was the cause of patrons in the bars taking condoms? Well, that was the prompting of the bar patrons with signs, so that was the independent variable. That was the cause. So dependent variable is the effect. In a cause and effect relationship, the effect is the dependent variable. And you can always ask yourself the question, what is the researcher collecting data on? And data begins with D, and dependent variable begins with D. Finally, in terms of variables, we have confounding or extraneous variables. Confounding or extraneous variables are variables that offer alternative explanations for the change that has taken place. In other words, it may not have been the intervention strategy or the independent variable. In our case, it may not be prompting bar patrons with signs that caused the change in the behavior. which was the amount of condoms taken. It may have been some other variable that the researchers did not consider that produced the observed results. So confounding or extraneous variables are variables that offer alternative explanations for the results and therefore may weaken the results. So researchers are always trying to control for confounding and extraneous variables. Okay, well, let's take a look at validity. There are two types of validity, internal validity and external validity. In a research study that has strong internal validity, we will be able to say with a very, very, very high degree of probability that it is the independent variable or the intervention strategy and the independent variable alone that was the cause in the change in the dependent variable or the behavior being measured. We can trust the results of the study because it has strong internal validity. If a study, again, has strong internal validity, we can say with a high degree of probability it was the independent variable. Or in our case, the article we read, we can say with a high degree of probability it was the prompting of bar patrons with signs that caused the increase in the condoms in the dependent variable. If a research article has very poor internal validity, well, there may be confounding or extraneous variables that cause the observed change in the dependent variable. Therefore, we cannot trust or put a great deal of trust in the results of that study. So internal validity is talking about the effect of the independent variable. And if a research has very, very good internal validity, we can say with a high degree of probability, it was the independent variable. It was the intervention that caused the change. Now, external validity is a little different. When researchers are conducting a research study, rarely do they have access to the entire population. So they take a sample of the population and they do the study on the sample. So there are many. So let's say the entire population might be 10,000 and the researchers may randomly select 500. So there's 9,500 people that are not in the study. So a research study that has strong external validity means that the results of the study can be generalized from the sample that the study was conducted on to the population that the sample was drawn from. The better the ability to generalize, the stronger the external validity. The less generalizability of the results, the weaker. So, if the researchers do a study and they select a sample, and their research study has strong external validity, then the results can be generalized from the sample to the population that the sample was drawn from. Well, okay, those are the terms. Now, this is a short video, but these terms are very important. So let's review quickly. Independent variable is the intervention or the intervention strategy that causes the change in the dependent variable. An intervention and independent variable both begin with I. The dependent variable is the effect as a result of the intervention strategy. It's the change that takes place, and we can always identify the dependent variable by asking, what are the researchers collecting data on? And then there are confounding or extraneous variables, and these variables offer alternative explanations for the results. And therefore, if a research study has many confounding or extraneous variables, we can't really trust the results. In terms of validity, there are two types. Internal validity. If a research study has very good internal validity, in other words, if it's done very well, The researchers have controlled for confounding and extraneous variables. Their methodology is done very well. Their sampling was appropriate. Then that research will have good internal validity, which means we can say with a high degree of probability that it is the independent variable or the intervention or the treatment that has caused the change in the dependent variable. External validity is a little different. Researchers conduct a study, they have a population, they choose a sample of that population and they conduct the study. If the study has strong external validity, then the results of the study can be generalized from the population, from the sample to the population. We can generalize the results to the population that the sample was drawn from, and that is external validity. Okay, well, these are critical terms. There are only 5 of them, but they are critical terms that you should become very familiar with. And in an attempt to become very familiar with them, here's a little assignment for you. Below are titles of hypothetical research studies, and for each study identify the dependent and independent variable. So you can create a Word document and do that. And here are the resources. And again, every attempt has been made to try and make this legitimate and reduce mistakes. However, mistakes do happen. Please let me know if they do. Well, thank you very much. See you next video.